And we're live! Hello all and welcome back to Sigil Spotlight. My name as always is Mr. Harlan Guthrie, and I am here once again with the lovely and talented Ms. Jo Fallick. How are you doing today, Jo?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I am doing exceptionally well.
Is it a competition now?
Yes, one must be doing better than the other to make it happen. I don't know what that means. A lot of great nerdy news going on today in the world. A lot of exciting projects are coming to fruition, as well as, let's not pull punches here, we got the new Batman movie that came out.
So exciting.
A lot of people, look, the Venn diagram of people who enjoy nerddom in the way that you and I do, of role-playing games and whatnot, and the amount of people that are lining up or have already seen the Batman, yeah, they're one and the same, I think.
There might be a sliver of people who are RPG nerds who don't like superhero movies.
I think they would just be contrarians because, frankly, superhero movies are boss. Do kids still say boss? Do kids use boss? Look, they think it's funny. Ladies and gentlemen, this is obviously a continuation of our series called Tips and Tricks. This is going to be episode 2. So last episode, we talked about a number of things that you might need as a GM or a player. We talked about... I'm gesturing too wildly with my hands.
Why? What happened?
Oh, I accidentally hit my microphone.
Oh, sorry,
we talked about game prep, i.e. the types of games, whether you need to be prepared, are you a convention or a first timer, all that kind of goodness. Mm-hmm. We talked about RPG etiquette on behalf of the GM or DM as well as the player. And we talked about creating memorable NPCs, or rather we briefly touched on that. And we were meant to talk about developing a campaign last episode as well, but we didn't get around to it because we just ended up rambling on for too long, as you and I are wont to do. So today will be a little bit more concise, hopefully, and we're going to be talking about that as well as 2 other issues. So the 3 issues we're going to be covering today, the 3 subjects we're going to be covering
The
today.
3 problems that we'll be
My
tackling.
hair is not doing good things.
I like it. I'm pro your hair.
Yeah?
Yeah.
We got developing a campaign. So this is like how to take a one-shot mentality and stretch it out in a way that's meaningful and not just filler. And if you're looking for a campaign, you can always check out our S5E campaign that's right here on YouTube, as well as the ongoing Hereafter campaign, which we just did an episode on Tuesday, which was pretty memorable. You might want to check it out. As well as, so developing a campaign, we're going to be talking about contingency planning. What that means in RPG space, and sort of how you can, as a GM primarily, we're speaking to the GMs, have yourself a few outs constantly along the way, which is always important for a good game.
What do you do when everything goes wrong?
Exactly. And finally, building player characters. And this isn't going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how to do it because that's system specific, but we're going to talk about the relationship between a GM and a player in terms of that character and how you as a GM can be incorporating their skills into the game that you're running, as well as how you as a player can make the character you're playing matter. And it's going to be an interesting conversation. Why do you laugh?
I thought you said madder, like more mad.
How are you going to make them even angrier?
Which is always the goal, really.
So, starting off with developing a campaign. Obviously, what is a campaign? It's a more long-term, long-form version of what you might play on a Saturday night one-off and done. It's about creating a sense of world building and a reality to the sort of storyline that you're going to create. And this comes down a lot to sort of writing in general in terms of what your characters are going through. Now, there's no one perfect way to do it. But it's important to have whatever goal that you want the players to sort of do, having the discussion with them and the understanding. First and foremost, when we talked about this sort of an etiquette, that when you sit down in the game, and game prep, I should say, that they know what tone you're going for, that they know sort of your goal and intention. So no one that sits down for a campaign, if you've done our last video correctly and you've spoken with your players and you discussed, should be unaware that it's a campaign, which means the agreement that the characters are going to more or less try to work together should be inherent. If it's not, what would you do, Jo? What's sort of the plan on that?
if it's not
If
clear
they're not
that
inherently like, oh, we're going to be working together from the beginning, because certain campaigns might force the characters off from the beginning to be, to be working together. Do you work that into your story? Is more what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I like to start by telling my player characters that, or sorry, by telling my players that they should be creating characters that are interested in working with a team in the long term.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with having a PC at the table who's only really interested in achieving a finite goal with a party, that once that goal is accomplished, they leave the story, and then the player can introduce a new character at their leisure.
Especially if it's been pre-discussed. If it's something that they're like, look, I can only play a few games on this, I want to step out at a certain point. That's fantastic. And sometimes it can give the DM a better opportunity to write something really exciting for them.
Yeah. I think if this is your first time playing through a campaign, developing a campaign, it can be really helpful to, if not play a table through another campaign, to at least read a pre-written campaign to get a sense of what kinds of story beats are common, and how the form of a campaign works, right? It's less of like an episode of television, which is like our one-shot analog, right? Where there's like one scenario and then at the end it gets resolved and that's it. In comparison, we're talking about like either a season of TV or like, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, where there are developing story arcs, mini big bads that get, there's like a confrontation with Sauron and Saruman and all those
all
the different Lord of the Rings bad guys. But do you know what I mean? Like getting a sense of the story structure in a larger context, right? Don't necessarily feel like you need to start by inventing an entire world. In fact, I would caution against developing a campaign by...
Especially if it's your first time.
By spending like 25 hours on world building.
Absolutely. One of the things that I think could be a pitfall, especially first-time DMs might fall into, is they get really excited about a world that they're constructing.
Yep.
And it's important to remember that no one cares as much about your world as you do.
I was going to say the exact same thing.
Well,
no one cares about the pantheon you're developing. No one cares about
as much, I should say. Because people will, there are absolutely players that will be really invested in learning about that. Don't get me wrong. There are many different types. But if you have a motivation to tell your players about your world first and foremost, you're going to have a bad time, because what you're going to do, either consciously or subconsciously, is you're going to push that narrative above all else.
Yeah. What you're doing is writing a book. You're not writing a game.
Exactly. And it's wonderful to have a rich world. And again, if you're not a first-time player, I think it's a wonderful motivation to try to create your own world and sort of all that stuff.
Get really granular, geopolitics and all that shit.
But if you're less precious about it, what will happen is, the way a role-playing game should function is that the world will come out in drips and drabs as the players investigate it, not having the GM tell them what the world is, what its rules are, what the pantheons are. Because RPGs, in general, are about discovery. They're about discovering your characters. They're about discovering the problems. They're about discovering solutions. They're about discovering all across the board. And when you sit down at a table and you say, okay, well, so here's the world, here's the conflicts, here's everyone involved, you're taking a big element of excitement away from the other players. And sometimes you might be at a table, and this happens often, where you're maybe even playing in an established world like Dungeons & Dragons, and someone at the table might already know about the world. And yeah, there are times where as an experienced player, you should also sort of respect other people at the table and not give away some of the answers. Certain enemies in Dungeons & Dragons have certain abilities and certain weaknesses. There are certain enemies that might be weak to water or something. Now, the more we play these games, the more likely it is that you're just going to inherently know that. But your character doesn't, and more importantly, if you're playing with other people at the table, they might not know it. So there's always a balancing act in how you want to let the information come to the players in a way that they get to discover it.
So we've told people what not to do. So don't focus on the world building too much at the outset of developing this campaign.
If you're a first time.
If you're a first timer.
I want to stress that because I totally recognize the want from a DM, if you're experienced, to start building your own worlds. And I think that's something that should be encouraged. Absolutely.
But let's pretend we're talking to someone who they've played through some one-shots. They've played through some, or shall I say, they've ran some one-shots. They've ran maybe a portion of a pre-written campaign. They kind of know what it's all about. They recognize that they're not going to put too much effort in at the outset to like map making and whatever else. How do they then begin to develop their own campaign?
Absolutely. So the first thing you want to do is to figure out what is your plot. And every game, every good RPG needs a plot. There is sort of this, I think, incorrect notion that RPGs are an endless sandbox. And the worlds are. The worlds are meant to emulate the real world in terms that, oh yeah, if you want to walk in this direction, you can continue going. And a good GM will just make up whatever is in that way or know it's in that way. That's perfectly fine. But every single RPG is a story. It's about telling a story, which means just as you would enjoy a good movie or book or TV show that has a good plot, your game needs a good plot as well too. And it's too often ignored that your plot needs to be something that's tangible in terms of having the player characters moving towards an end goal that is either solvable or unsolvable depending on how your play style is. And there are so many different genres and themes that you can be playing on. And the most classic idea of like a D&D is to lift from some other media, Lord of the Rings type formats is really what started inspiring this hobby, at least in the fantasy genre, besides wargaming and all that stuff. Because that was more the mechanic side. But, having these characters band together for one singular goal is entirely the purpose of an RPG in the traditional sense. So how do you pick what kind of thread you're doing? Well, the best part about being sort of an adaptive GM, which again we're going to talk about in a little bit, is being able to be adaptive in your storyline. You can absolutely pick up this idea. If you're excited about something, you can have that being a part of your campaign, which then leads to the bigger campaign. If we look at Curse of Strahd, which is a famous D&D module, that takes place in another plane of existence, the characters are brought there for a reason that doesn't come till later on, but sort of there's a smaller adventure that they want to finish first.
That's right. Start small, I would say. So come up with some small interaction, environment that the players can get used to the world and sort of suss out generally the feeling of the campaign, and then start sprinkling in some clues. Something, maybe they don't have answers yet. They find a key, they find a note, they talk to someone who's mysterious. You don't even have to have an answer for what they lead to, but just start adding elements.
Well, and this to me is where it starts to divide, because I think there are two ways that you can do this. An experienced GM, exactly as you're saying. An experienced GM, what you can do is run a one-off and see what kind of character, what the characters are enjoying about certain things, whether they find a key, and then from there develop your story. I think for a more first-time DM, I think it's less about that and more about understanding that there is a plot that they're trying to uncover. You know what I mean? Like you and I now, because we're experienced, that's how we would do it. We'd be like, we're doing a campaign, and then after game one, based on, what did Gary pick up, and what is Erica most interested in, and who is Ahmed going to be following after this? Then we would be like, okay, cool. From there, let's create a story because now I know the characters. But that's tough for a first time.
That's fair.
I think for a first time, it makes sense to figure out what your plot is. Are your characters being pulled to a king, and the king is giving them a quest, and they just need to receive go get the chest back from the dragon. You know what I mean? That's like the most simple, basic storyline. And I think as a first-time GM, just understanding what that storyline is and kind of coming up with it is necessary, because then you can sort of continue going on back to that thread.
To that point, I would say introduce the crux of the story fairly early on. whether it's defeating a big bad guy or, you know, changing whatever else. You don't want to wait until session 20 to start talking about like, oh, and by the way, there's this tyrant that you need to overthrow.
Absolutely. Planting seeds is one of the most important things in telling a campaign.
Yeah. You never want your PCs to be like, sorry, who's that guy? Why do we care?
Yeah.
Like, we're busy in this other town solving this rat problem or whatever else.
Now, and in that, you know, there are many different ways you run that thread. If it is meet the king gives you a quest, and your ultimate quest is defeat the dragon, that is a storyline. That's as easy as it needs to be. But where you sort of introduce those plot points, as Joe just said, is important. If you meet the king and the king says there's a terrible dragon that's ruining the land, but first he needs you to clear out a goblin cave, that's fine. That's still seed planting. And within that small sort of story structure, you can stretch it out for as long as you want, given that the end goal feels worthwhile. However, consider that the longer you stretch it out, the more meaningful the impact of the ending can be lessened.
Precisely.
Unless you are working your way towards, you know, reminding them constantly, or maybe showing that the dragon is terrorizing the land in a meaningful way. But in terms of the actual plot, what the goal is, on the onset for a first-time DM, you should have an idea of what that end goal is. Because then you have the ability to seed plant, to obfuscate that, to maybe even redirect them or give them red herrings at times, but then still get that seed planted early on so that you know where you're eventually going to be reaping it.
Just 2 final points from me, especially if you're playing with this particularly unruly group. Don't be afraid to have NPCs or correspondence occur that kind of redirects their focus back to the initial plot where necessary, to remind them. So they can have a prophetic dream, or they can come across someone who has a letter for them that reminds them like, oh, the king is waiting for you to kill this dragon. Allow them the benefit of the doubt, but also don't be afraid to remind them of their goals.
Yeah, additionally, and this should go back in RPG etiquette, there are certain DMs that will more or less punish the player if they don't remember certain things or take notes. That's bad DMing, because not everyone can write down everything. They're not listening to your book, and sometimes you don't say things as clear. It's fine if you want to maybe, you know, make a joke out of it a little bit and kind of be like, oh, you don't remember or whatever. But more or less, you shouldn't be punishing the real life players if they have just the inability to make a note at that time, because as a player, you also don't know what's relevant.
Especially if it's information that's really critical to the movement of your story.
Yeah.
Don't penalize people for not knowing it or being able to recall it or having notes.
What you should do is reward those who do remember.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, oh, you don't remember, what you can do is say, oh, does anyone remember the name of this dragon? And then if someone does, you can be like, fantastic job, inspiration, or whatever you want, if you want to benefit them. Because again, I mean, this is sort of parenting, but reward good behavior, don't punish bad behavior.
And then finally, if you have especially unruly characters at your table who are steadfast in their interest in things that are entirely outside the scope of your adventure, like, hey, I wrote a campaign that takes place in Faerun and all they want to do is get on a ship and leave and start exploring the coast in a new continent, it's totally fine for you to say, great, your character does that, but that's not in my story, so...
Yeah, and that goes back, I think, to last
we're not
going
to follow you there.
Exactly. That's an understanding that you should have. If you've done last week, which is game prep, if you've had the conversation with your players, they should have the expectation. And I think if you've done that properly, then there's no reason a character should do that, unless they're tired of the character, in which case they want to leave. So you have your campaign, you have your outline, you're like, okay, I know what I want the players to do. Where do you start? And my big advice is, and I've said this many times in many different podcasts and things, is to start before you start, or begin before you begin. If you want the first meaningful scene in this game to be them meeting the king, or rather that's the first important, then start them before that. You have them on the road, give them time to introduce their characters. Or if you want their first meaningful scene to be on the road, have them leaving town. Because to me, it always is better to have a little bit of a pickup to the first scene. Because no matter what, the first scene that you have as a GM in your mind, even if you find it's the most important, it's better to lead up to it than to start with it, because it will lose a little bit of steam, and everyone takes a few minutes to get into that role-playing mentality.
Absolutely.
2 last points on developing a campaign, which are very important. Seed planting is something we talked about. Seed planting essentially means you drop a interesting piece of interesting character,
Just a detail,
interesting symbol, an interesting detail, or an object that you maybe at the time don't necessarily have an end goal for.
a name.
Yeah.
Just a name.
But what it does is it gives you things to go back and eventually reap from what that's grown. I.e., if in the first episode they're on the road and they find a lost letter in a strange language, then it allows you to have the opportunity 10 episodes in or 10 games in, when someone is maybe looking for some subplot or B plot, or there's some worry where they need to find out if their cousin is okay, you now have a seed that you can say, oh, the letters on that page
Remember
suddenly
that
start
letter?
to shift, and you realize that it's a magic paper that allows you to talk to it and ask it a question, and it will send the letter anywhere in the world.
You get to have payoff.
Exactly. Additionally, it feels very clever from the standpoint. And finally, when developing a campaign, there is a real important, and this comes down to the GM listening to the game in terms of how am I enjoying this from a player or a viewer or an audience perspective. And this is much easier when you stream the way we do, but it's important to consider at your table too. Most role-playing games come down to action, exploration, and role-playing. And what that means is combat, i.e. action, moments where you're doing chunky mechanical combat, exploration, entering a new cave and getting to find all these amazing things about the world and maybe a map, and then role-playing, getting to interact with characters and getting to discover motivations within the party and without the party. A campaign, it is necessary, in my opinion, to move between these. And a good theme is to do one, then the next, then the next, then one, then the next, then the next. Because what ends up happening is either your campaign is way too front-loaded with action. If you have 3 sessions where you're just doing action, and then you go to role-playing, it's been nothing but action for so long. People can get out of the mood of role-playing. If your game is entirely role-play heavy, mechanics go by the wayside and you kind of lose those. And if you're not exploring enough of the world, the players lose interest in the world. So these are the 3 sort of pillars of a role-playing game, and pivoting between them, especially on a campaign that stretches out for hopefully a long time, it is necessary to constantly be moving between them.
You can weight a pillar more heavily depending on your table. If you know that your players really dislike combat, maybe you only need to sprinkle one in every now and then. Or if they have a hard time with roleplay and they prefer the crunch of combat, you can sort of tailor the flow to your table. But like Harlan said, it's nice to have a mix of all of them.
Absolutely.
And if you have really long sessions, if you sit down for 4 hours and you play with your table pretty commonly for a large chunk of time, you should do all 3 of those things within each session.
In an ideal world, I think you should always be aiming to do all 3 in a session. But I totally recognize that sometimes it doesn't work like that. You know what I mean? But there's also no reason, you're not beholden to anything. If you're like, well, they have to fight goblins in this episode, and this combat is going too long, and blah, blah, blah. And this kind of comes back to what we talked about last week, which is reading the room. As a DM, you got to read the poker faces. If you're recognizing that people are getting disinterested in combat and there's still 10 goblins left, that's fine. Have the leader die, and they throw up their arms.
Well, this dovetails nicely into contingency planning.
Exactly. So
see how we did that?
the next thing we want to talk about is contingency planning. What do you do if something happens? And there's a lot of options for this, especially when creating campaign, but in general. Now, killing a character is always a viable option for a dungeon master. Some dungeon masters prefer not to do it. Some dungeon masters prefer to do it only when it feels relevant to the story. Some dungeon masters enjoy killing characters. I don't think there's any right or wrong way to play that. Again, if you've done your game prep properly and you've talked to your players, that should be an element of what you discuss too. Hey, do you guys how do you feel if, we play this mechanically and you roll a bad die and that just ends your life? And most players are probably like, of course, who cares? It's a game. Some players are like, I put a lot of thought and effort into this character. I want them to go down in a meaningful way. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no gatekeeping in this hobby, or there shouldn't be, I should say. If someone is like, I don't want my character to really die, and the GM, you, are like, well, I want to kill your character, that is also a valid reason to just not play in that game. That's totally fine. It's a hobby. Do what you want to do. But having outs, whether a character dies or an NPC dies or a combat runs too long, is really important.
Absolutely.
So what are some contingencies that you use, Joe?
Well, when we talk about contingencies, honestly, it's a very broad concept. What do you do when something goes wrong or doesn't go the way that you're expecting? And it can be something as simple as, oh shit, my players walked into a store that I haven't populated and don't have any ideas about. And it can be something as serious as, like what you said, a character dies in the middle of a session. How do we deal with that? So in terms of my personal preparation for contingencies, I do like to rely very often on tables. So it's really nice to have maybe a tab open on your computer or a handy reference book. Maybe it's going to be like a player's handbook type analog or dungeon master's guide, whatever, just to have something that you can easily reference that's going to give you a list of names, occupations, different NPC voices or characteristics, stuff that's going to be in rooms, loot tables, even random encounters, those kinds of things. So when you need those resources, they are easily at hand.
Well, that's it. And we have a few friends. Dr. Tim Woods, he has a number of books, random tables. I think he has one for towns and cities, and he has one coming out in August called Dungeons and Layers. And again, they're just books that are like, how many guards are in this town? What kinds of guards?
I love that you and I both look to the place that the book is usually on your desk. We're both like, it's usually right there.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think having tables like that is an absolutely viable way to populate your world. And I think there is a incorrect notion that populating your world with tables means that they are less important. And that is, in my opinion, just lazy DMing. Because absolutely, someone walks into a store, you quickly roll on the table, and it's a potion shop. And you quickly roll on the table, and it's Agatha, an old, elderly, one-eyed woman who is running it.
Love that woman.
That's fine to establish. And if you want to leave it there, that's fine too. But you can absolutely then make that character part of the town. When the session's over, write out Agnes's backstory if that's the kind of player or GM you are. Have her have some kids. You can then populate it. The idea is contingency planning when you are sort of put on the spot.
Yeah.
It's trying to think quick about things. And equally viable, though not always recommended, is to just say, oh no, that shop is closed. You can sort of walk them down that path if you want. Especially if you're a first-time DM. And you want your world to feel alive and stuff like that. It's very common to populate a city with many different shops and towns.
My gosh. My first homebrew campaign, I spent so much time invested in just building a city because I was like, well, what if they want to go into this building on the map? Well, I have to know what's in there. And it was...
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Wasted effort, though.
Well, that's it. Most of the time, they won't go into those shops. Or if they are, you can just sort of be like, well, you see a light on in the shop. There are sort of story elements you can do. But contingency planning, it's always viable to sort of be like, oh, no, that's not accessible. Even if that feels a little cheap. And sometimes it is cheap, frankly. And if you're a first-time DM, you should not punish yourself or feel badly about that. Because there's no real way for you to understand 100% of the time what they're going to be going through. But if you have the ability to, roll with the punches, absolutely. We already talked about if a combat's running too long. Same with the role-play encounter. It sort of works on each of these, Additionally, exploration as well, too. If you are getting tired of exploration at any point, I can't count the number of times that I've had the players working through a mine or something, and I'm just bored of the exploration. So guess what? Everyone make dexterity roll. Oh no, the floor is weak, and now you're surrounded by goblins. Roll for initiative. Like, there's so many ways you can pivot between those three pillars. And
absolutely.
I think understanding those three pillars is a great way to have contingencies.
You're exploring these mines, and it just feels like, oh my god, it's interminable. They're just exploring every nook and cranny. They don't want to go anywhere without revealing the whole map. We'll drop in a prisoner, and then all of a sudden you have a role play encounter where they have to figure out who this person is and how to interact with them. Be cognizant, be mindful of the pacing, and use the contingency plan. Maybe have a couple up your sleeve that you're happy to throw in.
Well, that's it. If you're prepping for a session and you're sort of recognizing those three pillars, you know, especially if it's an open-ended session, if the players start off in a city and you know where you want them to go and you have that written, but they might go off the track, have an action encounter ready, have an exploration encounter ready, and have a role-play encounter ready. Because if they don't use them, you can always reuse them. You know,
Yep.
and this sort of falls into one of those reusability questions that, again, we get a lot. You're walking down a tunnel, and there's a left and a right, and you only have one way that you've planned. Now, there are two ways to view this. They walk down the tunnel that you haven't planned. Well, you just superimpose the tunnel that you had originally done, which is totally fine. The issue is when they go back to check the other tunnel, you haven't planned it. So if you don't
It's
leave,
a dead end.
well, if you don't leave yourself an out, then yeah, you're going to come up with an issue. But more importantly, my feeling is if you're making a fictional choice, it's not really a choice. So don't bother. Just make them go down the one way. Because in a way, as the DM, you have the ability to, and if you're not willing to populate that other corner, or if it's going to be a dead end, then don't fret about giving them the illusion of choice. Because most players, especially if they're experienced, will recognize it's the illusion anyway. And may end up feeling worse about it in the end, being frustrated at, well, why did we have to go all the way back if you knew it was going to be a dead end? So don't worry about having choices for the sake of choices. If you really want them to just go here and that's where your next story point is and that's where it's most interesting, that's akin to having the shop closed. And that's a viable choice.
If you are writing a campaign section that is a railroad, don't disguise it like a sandbox, because that's going to frustrate some people.
Exactly. You know, they could check, well, I'll check the next door. Well, that's locked too. I'll check the next door. That's locked too.
Like, why are there doors?
Exactly. You're sort of, and we get it, because as, you know, humans and storytellers, we want the appearance of this vast world, but sometimes that will bite us in the ass if we're worried too much about that.
Now, let's talk a little bit about contingency planning for when and if a player character dies, or in the event of a TPK. How do you handle that kind of momentous occasion?
Well, first and foremost, it's a great point, because Sigil is coming out with something specifically for 5e that deals exactly with this. So if you like the name Hereafter, keep that on your tongue, because in the next few months you're going to see something really interesting in the form of a Kickstarter for exactly that problem. But in a contingency way, a TPK or a character death, to me, and this brings my last major point when it comes to contingency planning, is when all else fails, stop the game. And I don't mean that in like a bitter or like a, oh, I don't know what to do. You can just end it. You know,
the session, not the game.
The session, sorry, the campaign over, everybody. No, the session. You know, if someone gets struck by a sword, and frankly, if a character is playing somebody for a while in a campaign, they probably would enjoy a break too, because can be emotional if you're attached to it. So when all else fails, I think it's totally viable, especially if a TPK, to just stop the game and to just, or stop the session, and if a player dies, just stop the session. Gives everyone a few days to sort of think about how they feel. Gives you ideas as a DM to like how to contingent. But if you're still running, what would you do, Joe?
Well, as far as the specifics, let's say you don't want to outright kill this player character. I mean, obviously you're not killing your players. You don't want to outright kill this character, but the die roll is what it was, and you said the damage, and the player goes down, and it is what it is. You have a couple of options. So your character that goes down, maybe they are taken prisoner, or maybe they sustain some grievous injury. Maybe they're knocked unconscious.
Maybe they pull a Gandalf.
Right? Maybe they come back more powerful than you could have ever imagined. What I mean to say is, even in the case of a TPK, you can have the characters wake up 24 hours later, as prisoners of whatever faction they were fighting, maybe they don't have their weapons anymore, maybe they have to engineer a jailbreak, use that as a jumping off point for the story to continue, maybe in a different direction.
Maybe in a different plane of existence. Maybe the plane of the undead.
Maybe they come back to life in the service of some religious cult that revived them all from death, and now they are undead.
And
or
it's been 500 years.
Who knows? What I'm saying is, you don't necessarily have to have all of this in your back pocket. Obviously, this would be a great opportunity, like Harlan said, to pause the games, to stop the session, to say we're going to reconvene. But you can use this as a new beginning. And I would really encourage a moment of decompression with whatever player it was that sustained this character death. Because as a DM, you want to make sure that that player is feeling okay. If they're like, oh yeah, no problem, I've got a backup character right here. Or if they're like, I've never lost a character before. I'm like, my day is ruined, right?
It happens.
You want to do a little bit of aftercare with them.
Absolutely. And finally, building player characters. And this is more referring to in terms of the relationship between the DM and the player. This is not about the mechanics of building a player or your choices as a player. That's completely up to you. But when building a player from the DM perspective, one of the things that you want to do, and I think is important with a session 0, is understanding what the player's strengths and weaknesses are. In terms of, if you're building a character that has a backstory where, their family was brutally murdered by some religious zealot, these are story points that you can be driving into your campaign. And the relationship between a player character and the DM is important, because you can be populating your game with diversity in terms of their skill set. And this is why it's also important to have exploration, action, and role-playing. There are going to be characters that hopefully have strong charisma, which will excel in the role-playing portions. There are going to be characters with strong investigation or history, which might be fun in the exploration. And there might be... Did I say exploration twice? I meant role-play. Did I say role-play? I can't remember now. And then you might have characters that are heavy strength and dex builds that really want action. Catering to these characters' skills or weaknesses, if that's the way you want to play it too, is important. And that's why a session 0 is important for the GM to sort of read about the character sheets, or at least understand the characters. So don't feel beholden to just have these faceless characters walk a campaign path. Rather, have elements along the way that are specific to their character's plight or their journey, so that we can see interesting role-playing. If a character was killed by a religious zealot, maybe on the road to their first encounter, they pass a carriage of that same religious iconography, that same religion. Obviously, these are not zealots, but what does the character do? Does the character care? Does the character reveal their backstory to other people? And building player characters with the DM, or at least having a relationship there, is important for that reason, because you're allowed to then create a more meaningful space for the players.
Absolutely. I would also just hazard a warning here that if you take a character's backstory and you want to use it for your own possibly nefarious purposes as a DM, just to quickly run some version of that by the player. You don't need to tell them, hey, I'm planning to do X, Y, and Z with your backstory. But if they invent like a loved one back home, or you just want to, you shouldn't kill that person off for no reason without that person's kind of consent about that, right? Like if they're a wandering adventurer and their husband's back home, you don't want to just like murder that person to
you have to
progress your story.
Exactly. You need a relationship with your players to recognize that they're hopefully trying to populate real people. And if they're playing properly, then you need to consider their feelings before doing any of that. Now, some players, they ride their characters like a stolen car or whatever. And
which is great.
Which is totally great, and they might not care about any of that. But they still will have backstories, and you as a DM still can include elements, even if they're just there to die. And hey, maybe the best thing you can do with them is give them an honorable and exciting death, because sometimes that's all we want. Anyway, that is it for episode 2 of Tips and Tricks. Again, we covered developing a campaign, contingency planning, and building player characters with a GM in a meaningful, campaign-focused way. Next week, or rather next episode, I think we want to talk about writing mysteries, the art of improvisation, and mastering the game. So definitely check that out. That's sort of more focused on, okay, you played a first campaign, or you played a few games. Now, how do you perfect it? How do you excel it? What are some of the pitfalls you're falling into?
Level up.
Yeah, exactly. So that's it from us. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. And as always, we'll see you around the table.